The date was August 8, 2025. It began like any other Friday. Stock markets opened with quiet optimism, but by mid-morning, everything had changed. A single, stark announcement from Washington, D.C. sent shockwaves across the globe. The United States had declared its intention to impose staggering tariffs on its closest allies. At the top of the list was Canada, a 40% levy on steel and aluminum, 35% on automotive parts, 50% on softwood lumber. The numbers seemed unreal, but they were very real. The longest undefended border in the world had been transformed into a formidable economic wall, severing the invisible lines of commerce with brutal efficiency. The economic fallout was not a slow trickle. It was a tidal wave. Within hours, the Canadian dollar plummeted to historic lows, wiping out billions in value. At border crossings across the country, long lines of transport trucks sat idle, their cargo suddenly too expensive to sell. Truck drivers found themselves out of work, their rigs parked and their futures uncertain. For Canadian families, the abstract numbers became painfully concrete. Groceries, gasoline, electronics, all suddenly more expensive. People who had been comfortably middle class were now anxiously wondering how they would make ends meet. The first wave of closures hit southwestern Ontario. An assembly plant in Windsor announced it was halting production indefinitely. Its primary market was gone. Thousands of workers were sent home. News reports filled with images of workers leaving their plants for the last time. In towns built around single industries, local businesses saw their customers disappear. The social fabric began to unravel. The story was the same across the country. Quebec aerospace companies, BC sawmills, prairie farmers, all watching their American contracts evaporate. In Ottawa, the Langevin block became the nerve center for Canada's response. A special cabinet committee met at all hours. The initial goal was simple: stop the bleeding. But their calls to Washington met with a cold, unyielding wall. Two factions emerged. Traditionalists argued for patience and diplomacy. Pragmatists contended that the world had fundamentally changed and Canada had to change with it. The name that came up again and again was BRICS. This was about more than trade statistics. It was a profound crisis of identity. A high-level delegation flew to Washington for what the media billed as an emergency summit. The Canadian team laid out their arguments with precision and passion, speaking of shared values and soldiers who fought together. The American response was unyielding. They viewed Canada not as a partner but as a competitor who had taken advantage of American goodwill. The delegation left Washington empty-handed, the mood heavy with realization that the old rules no longer applied. The failure sent a clear message: the path of traditional diplomacy was a dead end. The time for bold, decisive action had arrived. With Washington's door shut, the BRICS bloc offered immense opportunity. 40% of the world's population, massive growing economies, insatiable demand for Canadian resources. Imagine Canadian lumber building India's expanding cities, Canadian potash feeding Brazil's population, Canadian expertise contributing to South Africa's infrastructure. Trade envoys were quietly dispatched for exploratory talks. The initial feedback was positive, but the risks were immense. It meant dealing with authoritarian governments whose human rights records were diametrically opposed to Canada's values. Could Canada build partnerships with regimes that actively suppress dissent? The debate raging in Ottawa echoed across the country. It was a conversation that cut to the very core of what it meant to be Canadian. On one side were those who clung to the past, arguing the U.S. alliance was part of Canada's DNA. On the other were those who saw a chance to forge an independent path on the world stage. This was a choice between two different versions of Canada, one familiar and rooted in North American history, the other new, uncertain, and globally ambitious. For workers who had lost jobs, it was about immediate survival. For the nation, it was about the next century. The time for debate was drawing to a close. The moment of truth had arrived. A decision had to be made. To mend the old alliance required swallowing national pride. To build new alliances was to leap into the unknown. This was more than a policy decision. It was a defining moment for a generation. Would Canada cling to the safety of its past or boldly embrace the uncertainties of the future? Would it be defined by its geography or by its global ambitions? As the leaders gathered to make their final choice, they were not just deciding on a response to a trade crisis, they were charting the course for a nation at a crossroads. The Canada of yesterday was gone forever. A new Canada was about to be born, forged in the crucible of this unprecedented crisis. The choice had to be made.